The rain fell in gentle whispers across the Cotswolds countryside, each droplet carrying the weight of autumn's melancholy. Arthur Pendleton pulled his weathered coat tighter as he navigated the narrow lane that wound past his stone cottage, the familiar crunch of gravel beneath his boots, the only sound breaking the morning's profound silence. At 73, he had grown accustomed to solitude, but today something felt different, heavier, as if the very air held secrets waiting to unfold. He paused at the bend where the lane curved toward the village, his architect's eye automatically noting how the morning mist clung to the ancient dry stone walls like ghostly fingers. It was here, in this exact spot, that his world would shift on its axis. There, huddled against the base of a centuries-old oak tree, lay a sight that made his breath catch in his throat. A foal, barely more than a shadow of what a horse should be, trembled in the dampness. Its coat, matted and dulled by neglect, clung to ribs that showed too prominently beneath the skin. The creature's eyes, large and dark with an intelligence that seemed far too knowing for something so young, fixed on Arthur with a mixture of fear and desperate hope. One leg was bent at an unnatural angle, and with each labored breath, the foal's entire body shuddered, as if the simple act of living required more strength than it possessed. Arthur's hands, steady from decades of drafting precise architectural plans, trembled as he knelt beside the dying animal. The rain had intensified, turning the earth beneath them into a muddy canvas of desperation. He could feel the cold seeping through his knees, but something deeper than physical discomfort held him frozen in place. This wasn't just an abandoned animal. This was a mirror of every loss, every moment of helplessness he had carried since Margaret's death 3 years ago. "Jesus," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the rain's persistent drumming on the leaves overhead. The foal's breathing was so shallow that Arthur had to lean close to confirm it was still alive. When he did, those impossibly large eyes focused on him with such clarity that he felt something crack open inside his chest, a place he had kept carefully sealed since the funeral. The sound of approaching footsteps made him look up. David Morrison, his neighbor and the closest thing to a friend he had left, emerged from the mist like a specter of unwanted reality. David's face, weathered by 60 years of farming these hills, immediately registered the scene before him with the practiced assessment of a man who had witnessed too many such moments. "Arthur," David said, his voice carrying the weight of inevitable truth. "Step away from it, mate. That thing's half dead already." But Arthur couldn't move. Something about the foal's stillness, the way it seemed to be waiting rather than simply dying, held him captive. He reached out tentatively, his fingers barely grazing the matted fur of its neck. The animal didn't flinch. Instead, it seemed to lean into the touch with a trust that was both heartbreaking and inexplicable. "Look at it," David continued, his tone growing more insistent. "It's got a broken leg, probably internal injuries. Even if you could get it to a vet, which you can't afford, it's not going to make it through the night. You're just prolonging its suffering." The words hit Arthur like physical blows, each one echoing the voices of well-meaning friends and family who had surrounded him during Margaret's final months. "Let her go, Arthur. She's suffering. It's time." He had listened to them then, had made the rational choice, the humane choice, and he had regretted it every single day since. "No," Arthur said, the word emerging with a strength that surprised them both. He slipped his arms beneath the foal, feeling how light it was, how fragile. The animal made no sound of protest, only settled against his chest, with a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of surrender and hope in equal measure. David stepped closer, his expression shifting from practical concern to something approaching alarm. "Arthur, you're not thinking straight. That animal is going to die, and when it does, you're going to blame yourself. You're setting yourself up for heartbreak, and frankly, I don't think you can handle another loss right now." The brutal honesty of the statement hung between them like a challenge. Arthur knew David was right about his fragile emotional state, about the practical impossibilities of nursing a dying foal back to health, about the likelihood of failure. But as he stood there in the rain, feeling the barely perceptible warmth of the small body against his chest, he realized that the fear of loss had already cost him too much. "Maybe," Arthur said quietly, adjusting his grip to better support the foal's injured leg. "But I can't walk away. Not this time." David's face cycled through frustration, concern, and finally resignation. "You're buying yourself a rope to hang yourself with, Arthur. That thing won't last the week." Arthur began walking toward his cottage, each step measured and careful to avoid jostling his fragile burden. The foal's breathing seemed to steady slightly against his chest, or perhaps that was wishful thinking. Either way, he found himself whispering to it as they moved through the rain. Nonsensical words of comfort that seemed to flow from some deep well of need he hadn't known existed. "We'll call you Willow," he murmured, the name appearing in his mind unbidden. "Like the trees by the stream behind the house. They bend but don't break, no matter how hard the wind blows." Behind him, David's voice carried on the wind, heavy with the certainty of a man who had seen too many hopeless causes. "You're going to regret this, Arthur. Mark my words. This is going to break what's left of your heart." But Arthur was already pushing through the gate to his cottage, already planning the warm corner of the kitchen where he could make a bed of old blankets, already calculating how often he would need to check on the foal through the night. For the first time in 3 years, he had something that needed him to survive, something that depended entirely on his refusal to give up hope. As he crossed the threshold of his home, Willow's eyes fluttered open once more, meeting his with that same inexplicable trust. In that moment, Arthur understood that David was both completely right and utterly wrong. This would either break his heart or heal it, but either way, he was finally, truly alive again. The rain continued to fall outside, but within the walls of the stone cottage, something new was beginning to take root. Something fragile and impossible and absolutely necessary. The veterinary clinic smelled of antiseptic and old leather, a combination that made Arthur's stomach clench with memories he'd rather forget. Dr. Harrison, a weathered man whose hands bore the scars of 40 years treating farm animals, examined Willow with the methodical precision of someone who had seen too many hopeless cases. The foal lay motionless on the metal examination table, her breathing so shallow that Arthur found himself holding his own breath, waiting for each rise and fall of her tiny chest. "I won't lie to you, Arthur," Dr. Harrison said, his voice carrying the weight of unwelcome truth. "The chances of survival are nearly zero. She's severely malnourished, dehydrated, and that leg—" He gestured toward the obviously broken limb with a shake of his head. "Even if we could set it properly, which is questionable given her condition, the stress of treatment alone might kill her." Arthur's hands trembled as he reached out to stroke Willow's matted mane. The foal's eyes fluttered open at his touch, those impossibly large brown eyes that seemed to hold depths of understanding far beyond her young age. In that moment, something shifted inside Arthur's chest, a recognition, perhaps, of one broken soul reaching out to another. "What would you do?" Arthur asked quietly, though he already knew the answer. Dr. Harrison sighed, removing his glasses to clean them with practiced efficiency. "The humane thing would be to put her out of her misery. She's suffering, Arthur. Sometimes the kindest act is letting go." The words echoed through Arthur like a physical blow, transporting him back to another sterile room, another impossible choice. Margaret's hand in his, growing colder by the hour, while doctors spoke in hushed tones about quality of life and difficult decisions. He had listened then, had made the rational choice, the compassionate choice, and he had carried the weight of that decision every day since, wondering if he had given up too soon, if there might have been another way. "No," Arthur said, the word emerging with startling clarity. "I want to try." Dr. Harrison studied him for a long moment, his expression cycling through surprise, concern, and finally resignation. "Arthur, I've known you since you moved to the Cotswolds 15 years ago. You're a good man, but you're also a man who's been through hell. I don't want to see you set yourself up for more heartbreak." Arthur's architect's mind, trained to see potential in the most damaged structures, began calculating possibilities. What would it take, hypothetically? Round-the-clock care for at least 2 weeks, assuming she survives the first 48 hours. Tube feeding every 2 hours. Constant monitoring. The leg would need to be splinted, though I'm not optimistic about it healing properly. And even then, Dr. Harrison shrugged helplessly. The odds are still against her. But there's a chance. A very small one. Arthur looked down at Willow, whose eyes had closed again. Her breathing barely perceptible. Something about her stillness reminded him not of death, but of waiting, as if she were holding on for his decision, trusting him to choose hope over despair. "I'll take those odds," Arthur said. The drive home was surreal, Willow nestled in a makeshift bed of blankets on the passenger seat, a bag of medical supplies and feeding equipment in the back. Dr. Harrison had provided detailed instructions, his professional demeanor masking what Arthur suspected was genuine concern for both patient and caretaker. The feeding tube, the antibiotics, the careful positioning to prevent further injury to the broken leg. It all felt overwhelming and impossibly delicate. Arthur's cottage, built of honey-colored Cotswold stone in the 1800s, had always been a sanctuary. After Margaret's death, it had become something closer to a mausoleum, filled with memories and silence. But as he carried Willow inside, settling her in a nest of blankets near the kitchen's warmth, the house seemed to exhale, as if it too had been holding its breath. The first night was the longest of Arthur's life since Margaret's final hospitalization. Every 2 hours, he woke to check on Willow, to administer the carefully measured formula through the feeding tube, to monitor her breathing and adjust her position. The foal accepted these ministrations with an otherworldly patience, never fighting the tube, never struggling against his touch. It was as if she understood that her survival depended on his care, and she was determined to make his job as easy as possible. By the third day, something had changed. Willow's breathing was stronger, more regular. Her eyes, when they opened, seemed more alert, more present. And when Arthur knelt beside her with the morning feeding, she did something that made his heart skip. She nuzzled his hand with her soft muzzle, a gesture so gentle and trusting that tears sprang to his eyes. "There you are," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I was wondering when you'd decide to stay." The routine became Arthur's new religion. Every 2 hours, day and night, he was there with food, with medicine, with gentle words of encouragement. He found himself talking to Willow constantly, sharing stories of his life, his work as an architect, his memories of Margaret. The foal listened with the intensity of a therapist, her dark eyes never leaving his face when he spoke. "Margaret would have loved you," he told her one evening as rain drummed against the windows. "She always said I needed something to take care of besides my blueprints and my garden." She was right, as usual. It was on the 7th day that Willow made her first real attempt to stand. Arthur was dozing in the chair he'd moved beside her makeshift bed when a soft rustling woke him. Willow was struggling to get her legs beneath her, her movements awkward but determined. The splinted leg made balance nearly impossible, but she kept trying, falling back onto the blankets with huffs of frustration that sounded almost human. "Easy, girl," Arthur murmured, kneeling beside her. "There's no rush." But Willow seemed to disagree. With a determination that belied her size and condition, she made another attempt, this time managing to get her front legs steady before her hindquarters followed. She swayed dangerously, the broken leg unable to bear weight. But she was standing. Actually standing. Arthur felt something crack open in his chest. Not the painful breaking he'd grown accustomed to, but something warmer, more hopeful. For the first time since Margaret's death, he felt the stirring of genuine joy. "Look at you," he breathed, hardly daring to move lest he startle her back to the ground. "Just look at you, brave girl." Willow stood for perhaps 30 seconds before her strength gave out, and she sank back onto the blankets. But those 30 seconds had changed everything. They were no longer just fighting for survival. They were fighting for a future, for the possibility of something more than mere existence. That night, as Arthur settled into his chair for another round of vigilant watching, Willow's eyes found his in the lamplight. And for the first time since he'd found her by the roadside, Arthur allowed himself to believe that David Morrison might be wrong. This might not break his heart after all. This might be exactly what both of them needed to heal. The morning light filtered through the lace curtains of Arthur's bedroom window, casting delicate patterns across the wooden floor where Willow had taken to sleeping. It had been 3 months since that first desperate night, and the transformation was nothing short of miraculous. Where once lay a dying foal, now stood a young horse whose coat gleamed with health, whose eyes sparkled with intelligence and unmistakable devotion. But it was more than physical healing that had taken place within the stone walls of the cottage. Something deeper, more profound, had blossomed between man and animal. Arthur woke each morning to the soft sound of Willow's breathing, a rhythm that had become as essential to his existence as his own heartbeat. The routine they had developed was sacred in its simplicity. Arthur would rise at dawn, prepare a warm mash of oats and molasses, and step outside to where Willow waited by the garden gate, her ears pricked forward in anticipation. She had grown tall enough now that her head reached Arthur's shoulder, and when she nuzzled his neck in greeting, her breath was warm and sweet against his weathered skin. "Good morning, my girl," Arthur would whisper, running his hands along her neck, feeling the strong muscles that had developed beneath the glossy coat. "Ready for our walk?" Their daily journey had become legendary in the village. Each morning, Arthur and Willow would set out along the ancient footpaths that crisscrossed the Cotswolds, past dry stone walls older than memory, through meadows where sheep grazed in contentment, and along streams that babbled their eternal songs. Willow walked beside Arthur without lead or halter, matching his pace perfectly, stopping when he stopped, turning when he turned, as if they shared a single mind. The villagers had grown accustomed to the sight, though it never failed to draw smiles and whispered comments. Mrs. Henderson from the post office would wave from her window, calling out, "Morning, Arthur! Morning, Willow!" The old horse would actually turn her head toward the greeting, as if she understood not just her name but the warmth behind it. Children on their way to school would pause to watch them pass, their faces filled with wonder at the sight of such perfect companionship. But it was during the quiet moments, when they paused to rest by the old oak where Arthur had first found her, that the true depth of their bond became apparent. Willow would lower her great head to rest against Arthur's shoulder, and he would feel the weight of absolute trust, absolute love. In those moments, the loneliness that had consumed him since Margaret's death would lift like morning mist, replaced by something he had thought lost forever: purpose, connection, joy. Dr. Harrison, who had initially given Willow no chance of survival, had become one of their most frequent visitors. He would arrive unannounced, ostensibly to check on his former patient, but Arthur suspected the veterinarian came as much for his own healing as for Willow's. The doctor had lost his own wife 2 years prior, and in the cottage filled with warmth and the gentle presence of the remarkable horse, he found a peace that had eluded him in his empty house. "I've been practicing veterinary medicine for 40 years, Dr. Harrison said one afternoon as they watched Willow graze in the meadow behind the cottage. "I've seen animals recover from injuries that should have killed them, witnessed bonds between humans and animals that defied explanation. But this—" He gestured toward Willow, who had lifted her head to look directly at them, as if sensing she was the subject of their conversation. "This is something beyond my understanding of medicine or science." Arthur nodded, understanding exactly what the doctor meant. There were moments when Willow seemed to anticipate his needs before he was aware of them himself. If he felt unsteady on their walks, she would position herself so he could lean against her strength. When the anniversary of Margaret's death approached and Arthur's mood grew heavy with grief, Willow would stay closer to the house, never venturing far from his side, her presence a constant comfort. The most remarkable incident had occurred on a particularly difficult evening in late autumn. Arthur had been sitting in his study, looking through old photographs of Margaret, when the familiar weight of sorrow had settled over him like a shroud. He had not called out, had made no sound of distress, yet within minutes he heard the soft thud of hooves on the wooden porch, followed by a gentle knocking at the front door. When he opened it, Willow stood there, her dark eyes filled with concern, as if she had sensed his pain from across the meadow where she had been grazing. "How did you know?" Arthur had whispered, wrapping his arms around her neck, feeling the steady strength of her presence chase away the shadows in his heart. The seasons changed, and with them came new rhythms to their shared life. In winter, Arthur would brush the snow from Willow's coat and ensure her shelter was warm and dry. She had grown into a magnificent mare, her movements graceful and sure, her intelligence evident in every interaction. When spring returned, bringing with it the anniversary of their first meeting, Arthur led Willow back to the spot where he had found her, now marked by wildflowers that seemed to bloom more abundantly each year. "Do you remember, girl?" Arthur asked, his voice thick with emotion. "Do you remember how small you were? How close we came to losing you?" Willow stood perfectly still, her head turned toward the exact spot where she had lain dying, and Arthur could have sworn he saw recognition in her eyes, along with something that looked remarkably like gratitude. The transformation was not Arthur's alone. The cottage itself seemed to have awakened from a long sleep. Where once silence had reigned, now there was the gentle sound of Willow's movements in the paddock Arthur had built for her, the soft nickering that greeted him each morning, the rhythmic sound of her breathing that lulled him to sleep each night. The house felt alive again, filled with purpose and love. Neighbors began to visit more frequently, drawn by the warmth that seemed to radiate from the cottage and its remarkable inhabitants. David Morrison, who had been so certain that Arthur was setting himself up for heartbreak, became one of Willow's most devoted admirers, often bringing carrots and apples as peace offerings for his initial skepticism. "I was wrong, Arthur," David admitted one evening as they watched Willow roll in the grass, her legs kicking playfully in the air. "Dead wrong. That horse didn't break your heart. She healed it." Arthur smiled, running his hand along Willow's neck as she came to stand beside him, grass stains decorating her coat like badges of joy. "She saved us both," he said quietly. "I just didn't realize how much saving I needed until she showed me what it meant to truly live again." As the sun set over the Cotswolds, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose, Arthur and Willow stood together in perfect contentment, two souls who had found in each other exactly what they needed to heal, to hope, and to love again. The first sign came on a Tuesday morning in late September, when the autumn mist hung heavy over the Cotswolds like a shroud of premonition. Arthur had been mucking out Willow's stable, a task he had performed countless times over the past 5 years, when suddenly the pitchfork felt impossibly heavy in his hands. The familiar ache in his chest, which he had dismissed as nothing more than the natural consequence of aging, suddenly intensified into something sharp and demanding. He dropped the tool, pressing his palm against his sternum as his breath came in short, painful gasps. Willow, who had been grazing peacefully in the adjacent paddock, immediately lifted her head. Her ears swiveled toward Arthur with an alertness that seemed to transcend normal animal awareness. She approached the fence with deliberate steps, her dark eyes fixed on his face with an intensity that made Arthur's skin prickle with recognition. There was something in her gaze, a knowing, a sensing, that went far beyond the usual concern of a beloved pet for its owner. "I'm all right, girl," Arthur whispered, though his voice carried a tremor that betrayed his words. "Just need to catch my breath." But Willow didn't move away. Instead, she pressed her muzzle against the wooden fence rail, her nostrils flaring as if she could smell the change in him, the subtle shift in his body's chemistry that spoke of something fundamental going wrong. Her behavior was so unusual, so purposeful, that Arthur found himself studying her face as intently as she studied his. In that moment, he could have sworn she was trying to tell him something, trying to communicate a warning that transcended the boundaries between species. The pain subsided after several minutes, leaving Arthur shaken but determined to dismiss it as nothing more than indigestion or perhaps the result of lifting too much weight. He finished his chores with deliberate normalcy, speaking to Willow in the same gentle tones he always used, but he couldn't shake the memory of her reaction, the way she had seemed to sense his distress before he had fully acknowledged it himself. That evening, as Arthur sat in his study reviewing architectural plans for a local church restoration, work he had taken on more for the joy of creation than financial necessity, the phone rang with jarring persistence. The voice on the other end belonged to Liam, his nephew from London, a young man of 32 whose visits had become increasingly frequent since Arthur's 70th birthday. "Uncle Arthur." Liam's voice carried the particular blend of affection and concern that had become familiar over recent months. "I was thinking of coming down for the weekend. How are you feeling?" Arthur hesitated, his fingers unconsciously moving to his chest, where the morning's pain had centered. "I'm fine, Liam. You don't need to worry about your old uncle. Willow and I are managing quite well." "That's exactly what I'm worried about," Liam replied with a gentle laugh that didn't quite mask his underlying anxiety. "You and that horse of yours, living in your own little world. When was the last time you saw Dr. Harrison? Not for Willow, but for yourself. The question hung in the air between them, weighted with implications that Arthur wasn't ready to confront. He had always prided himself on his independence, his ability to care for himself and his beloved mare without assistance from anyone. The idea of admitting weakness, of acknowledging that his body might be failing him, felt like a betrayal of everything he had built in the years since Margaret's death. "I saw him just last month," Arthur said, which was technically true, though the visit had been for Willow's routine checkup rather than his own health. "Uncle Arthur." Liam's voice carried the patient tone of someone who had learned to navigate his uncle's stubborn independence. "I'm coming down this weekend. We can have dinner, maybe take a walk with Willow. I haven't seen her in months." After ending the call, Arthur found himself drawn to the window that overlooked the paddock where Willow spent her evenings. The mare stood silhouetted against the darkening sky, her head turned toward the house as if she were keeping watch. There was something almost sentinel-like about her posture, a vigilance that seemed to extend beyond normal animal behavior into something more profound and protective. The next morning brought another episode, this one more severe than the first. Arthur was carrying a bucket of water to Willow's trough when the pain struck like lightning, radiating from his chest down his left arm with such intensity that he dropped the bucket, water splashing across the cobblestones of the stable yard. He sank to his knees, gasping for air, his vision blurring at the edges as his heart hammered against his ribs with irregular, frightening rhythm. Willow's response was immediate and extraordinary. She galloped across the paddock with a speed and urgency Arthur had never seen from her, her hooves thundering against the ground as she approached the fence. But instead of stopping at the barrier, she began to pace along its length, whinnying with a sound that was less horse-like and more akin to a human cry of distress. Her calls were so loud, so insistent, that they drew the attention of David Morrison, who was working in his adjacent field. David appeared at the gate within minutes, his weathered face creased with concern as he took in the scene. Arthur on his knees in the stable yard, Willow pacing frantically behind the fence, her calls echoing across the countryside like an alarm. "Arthur!" David called out, rushing to his neighbor's side. "What's happened? Should I call for help?" Arthur wanted to protest, to insist that he was fine, but the words wouldn't come. The pain was too intense, too overwhelming, and for the first time since Margaret's death, he felt truly frightened. Not of dying, he had made his peace with mortality years ago, but of leaving Willow alone, of abandoning the creature who had become the center of his existence. "I think," Arthur managed to gasp between labored breaths, "I think I need to see a doctor." David helped Arthur to his feet, supporting his weight as they made their way toward the house. Behind them, Willow continued her distressed calling, her voice carrying across the hills with a mournful intensity that seemed to speak of loss and abandonment, of a bond threatened by forces beyond her understanding. As they reached the cottage door, Arthur turned back to look at his beloved mare. She had stopped pacing and now stood perfectly still at the fence, her dark eyes fixed on his face with an expression of such profound understanding that it took his breath away. In that moment, Arthur realized that Willow hadn't just sensed his physical distress. She had recognized the deeper truth that he was only beginning to acknowledge. The life they had built together, the perfect partnership that had sustained them both through years of quiet contentment, was about to face its greatest test. And somehow, in ways that defied rational explanation, Willow already knew. The clouds that had been gathering on the horizon all morning finally opened, releasing their burden in a gentle rain that seemed to weep for the uncertainty that lay ahead. Arthur watched through the window as Willow remained at her post by the fence, her coat darkening with moisture, her vigil unbroken despite the weather. She was waiting, Arthur realized. Waiting and watching and preparing herself for whatever was to come. Just as she had waited by the roadside all those years ago, trusting that someone would come to save her, she was now preparing to save him in return. The circle was closing, and neither of them knew what the completion of that circle might bring. The London rain drummed against the windows of the sleek glass office building as Liam Morrison Pendleton adjusted his tie and checked his watch for the third time in 5 minutes. At 32, he had built a successful career in architectural consulting, following in his uncle's footsteps, but choosing the fast-paced world of urban development over the quiet restoration projects that had defined Arthur's later years. The irony wasn't lost on him that he was about to leave behind everything he had worked for, to return to the countryside he had spent his adult life trying to escape. The train journey from London to the Cotswolds felt like traveling backward through time. As the urban sprawl gave way to rolling hills and stone villages, Liam found himself remembering childhood summers spent at his uncle's cottage, back when Aunt Margaret was still alive and the house rang with laughter instead of the profound silence that had settled over it in recent years. He had visited less frequently after her death, partly because of his demanding career, but mostly because he couldn't bear to see the way grief had hollowed out the man who had once seemed larger than life. Arthur had been more than an uncle to Liam. He had been a mentor, a father figure during the tumultuous years after Liam's own parents had divorced. While his mother had remarried and started a new family, and his father had disappeared into a series of business ventures and younger wives, Arthur had remained constant. Every school holiday, every summer break, the cottage in the Cotswolds had been Liam's sanctuary, a place where he could learn about architecture and craftsmanship from a master, where he could help with restoration projects and feel the satisfaction of bringing old buildings back to life. But that was before Willow. Liam's relationship with his uncle had grown complicated after Arthur rescued the dying foal. What had begun as admiration for Arthur's compassion had gradually transformed into concern, then worry, and finally a kind of frustrated helplessness as he watched his uncle pour all his emotional energy into caring for an animal that, by all reasonable expectations, should have died within days of being found. The taxi from the station wound through familiar lanes, past dry stone walls that Arthur had taught him to appreciate for their centuries-old craftsmanship, past cottages whose architectural details he could identify thanks to his uncle's patient instruction. But as they approached Arthur's property, Liam felt his chest tighten with apprehension. He hadn't been entirely honest during their phone conversation. This wasn't just a casual weekend visit. His uncle's doctor had called him 3 days ago, expressing concerns about Arthur's health and his increasing isolation. "He's not taking care of himself properly," Dr. Harrison had explained during their confidential conversation. "His blood pressure is dangerously high, he's lost weight, and frankly, I'm worried about his mental state. He talks about that horse as if it were a person, and he seems to have no other social connections. I think he needs family intervention, but he's too proud to ask for help." The cottage looked smaller than Liam remembered, its honey-colored stone walls weathered but still beautiful in the afternoon light. Smoke curled from the chimney, and he could see Arthur's silhouette moving past the kitchen window. But it was the sight of Willow that stopped Liam in his tracks as he paid the taxi driver and gathered his weekend bag. The mare stood in the paddock adjacent to the cottage, and she was magnificent. Gone was any trace of the skeletal, dying creature Arthur had described rescuing 5 years ago. Willow had grown into a powerful, graceful animal with a glossy chestnut coat and intelligent dark eyes that seemed to track every movement around the property. But what struck Liam most forcefully was her positioning. She stood facing the cottage, her attention focused entirely on the building, as if she were standing guard. Arthur emerged from the cottage before Liam could knock, and the sight of his uncle sent a shock of concern through him. The man who had once seemed indestructible now appeared fragile, his clothes hanging loose on a frame that had clearly lost considerable weight. His hair, once thick and silver, had thinned to wispy strands, and his skin had the pale, translucent quality that spoke of too much time spent indoors. "Liam," Arthur said, his face lighting up with genuine pleasure. "You made good time from London." They embraced, and Liam was alarmed by how frail his uncle felt in his arms. But before he could voice his concerns, a soft nickering drew their attention to the paddock. Willow had approached the fence and was watching their reunion with what could only be described as intense interest. "She remembers you," Arthur said, his voice carrying a warmth that had been absent during their phone conversation. "Willow has an extraordinary memory for people." Liam approached the fence cautiously, remembering his uncle's warnings about not making sudden movements around the mare. But Willow showed no signs of nervousness. Instead, she extended her neck over the fence rail, allowing Liam to stroke her muzzle. Her coat was impossibly soft, and her eyes held a depth of intelligence that was genuinely unsettling. "She's beautiful, Uncle Arthur," Liam said, and meant it. Whatever his concerns about his uncle's attachment to the animal, he couldn't deny that Willow was remarkable. Over dinner, a simple meal that Arthur had clearly taken care to prepare properly for his guest, Liam began to understand the true nature of the relationship between his uncle and the mare. Arthur spoke about Willow with the same tenderness and pride that other people reserved for discussing their children. He knew her moods, her preferences, her daily routines with an intimacy that was both touching and slightly alarming. "She has nightmares sometimes," Arthur explained as they sat by the fire after dinner. "She'll wake up whinnying, and I can see her legs moving as if she's trying to run. I think she dreams about being abandoned, about those first terrible days when she was dying by the roadside." Through the window, Liam could see Willow in her stable, and even in the dim light, it was clear that she was facing toward the cottage, toward the window where Arthur sat. "Does she always position herself like that?" Liam asked. Arthur followed his gaze and smiled. "She likes to keep an eye on things. Sometimes I think she's more concerned about my welfare than I am." As if to prove his point, Willow moved closer to the stable door, her head visible in the opening as she continued her vigil. "Uncle Arthur," Liam began carefully, "Dr. Harrison mentioned that you haven't been feeling well lately." Arthur's expression immediately became guarded. "Harrison worries too much. I'm fine." "Are you? Because you look like you've lost weight, and you seem tired." "I'm 73 years old, Liam. Of course I'm tired." But even as Arthur dismissed his nephew's concerns, Liam noticed the way his uncle's hand moved unconsciously to his chest, the slight shortness of breath that punctuated his sentences. The signs were subtle but unmistakable to someone who cared enough to look for them. That night, Liam lay in the guest room that had been his sanctuary during childhood summers, listening to the familiar sounds of the countryside. But there were new sounds, too. The soft movement of Willow in her stable, the occasional gentle nicker that seemed to be directed toward the cottage. At one point, he heard his uncle's footsteps on the stairs, followed by the sound of the kitchen door opening. Through his window, Liam could see Arthur's silhouette as he walked to Willow's stable, speaking to her in low, soothing tones. The sight filled Liam with a complex mixture of emotions. There was something beautiful about the bond between his uncle and the mare, something that spoke to the healing power of love and care. But there was also something troubling about Arthur's isolation, his apparent dependence on an animal for emotional sustenance that should have come from human relationships. As he watched Arthur return to the cottage, Liam realized that his weekend visit had become something more significant. He wasn't just here to check on his uncle's health. He was here to witness and perhaps to understand a relationship that defied conventional explanation. And perhaps, if he was honest with himself, he was here to prepare for the possibility that this remarkable partnership between man and horse might not last forever. The thought sent a chill through him that had nothing to do with the cool night air drifting through his window. The morning of Arthur's funeral dawned gray and mournful, with low clouds hanging over the Cotswolds like a shroud of collective grief. The ancient stone church of St. Michael's, where Arthur and Margaret had been married 47 years earlier, stood sentinel against the pewter sky, its Norman tower bearing witness to centuries of human joy and sorrow. Inside the sanctuary, the pews filled with faces that told the story of a life well lived, neighbors who had watched Arthur transform from a grieving widower into a man renewed by an extraordinary bond, colleagues from his architectural practice who remembered his meticulous attention to detail, and villagers whose lives had been touched by his quiet kindness. Liam sat in the front pew, his hands folded tightly in his lap as he struggled to maintain composure. The past week had been a blur of arrangements and condolences, phone calls to distant relatives, and the surreal experience of planning a funeral for a man who had, by all medical understanding, already died once before. The miracle of Arthur's revival, what the doctors had cautiously termed a cataleptic episode brought on by severe cardiac stress, had given them 6 precious additional months together. 6 months of gentle conversations, shared meals, and quiet afternoons watching Willow graze in the meadow beyond the cottage windows. But those months had also been shadowed by the knowledge that Arthur's heart was irreparably damaged, that each day was borrowed time. When the final heart attack came, swift and merciful in the early hours of a Tuesday morning, Arthur had slipped away peacefully in his sleep, his hand resting on the windowsill where he could see Willow standing guard in the pre-dawn darkness. The service itself was a testament to Arthur's character, simple, dignified, and filled with genuine affection. The vicar, Reverend Matthews, spoke of Arthur's dedication to preserving the architectural heritage of the Cotswolds, his patient restoration of ancient buildings that might otherwise have crumbled into forgotten ruins. David Morrison, Arthur's neighbor and reluctant convert to Willow's cause, delivered a eulogy that brought tears to many eyes as he described the transformation he had witnessed in his friend. "Arthur taught me something about hope," David said, his weathered hands gripping the pulpit as his voice carried across the hushed congregation. "When he found that dying foal by the roadside, I told him he was buying himself heartbreak. I was wrong. He wasn't buying heartbreak. He was investing in love, and that investment paid dividends beyond anything I could have imagined. But it was the absence that spoke loudest of all." Throughout the service, every person in that church was acutely aware of the empty space where Willow should have been. The mare had been Arthur's constant companion for the past 6 years, his shadow and his salvation, yet she could not follow him into this final gathering of remembrance. She waited instead in the paddock behind the cottage, her vigil unbroken even in death, her dark eyes fixed on the lane that would eventually bring Arthur home one last time. After the service, As the congregation filed out into the churchyard where Arthur would be laid to rest beside Margaret, Liam found himself overwhelmed by the weight of decisions that lay ahead. Well-meaning friends and neighbors approached with offers of help, suggestions about what to do with the cottage, gentle inquiries about Willow's future. Each conversation felt like a small betrayal of the life Arthur had built, the careful balance he had maintained between solitude and connection, between grief and healing. The burial itself was mercifully brief. As the simple wooden coffin was lowered into the earth, Liam thought he heard something that made his heart skip. The distant sound of whinnying carried on the wind from the direction of the cottage. It was impossible, of course. The distance was too great, the sound too faint to travel so far. But others heard it too, judging by the way heads turned and eyes widened with recognition. Dr. Harrison, who had attended both as mourner and as the veterinarian who had witnessed Willow's impossible recovery, placed a gentle hand on Liam's shoulder. "She knows," he said quietly. "Animals have ways of understanding that we can't explain. She's saying goodbye." The reception at the village hall was a subdued affair, filled with the kind of awkward conversations that follow funerals, shared memories, expressions of sympathy, and the inevitable questions about what would happen next. Liam found himself fielding inquiries about the cottage, about his plans to return to London, about Willow's fate with a growing sense of panic. He hadn't allowed himself to think beyond the immediate necessity of honoring Arthur's memory, but now the future loomed before him with all its impossible complications. It was Mrs. Henderson from the post office who finally voiced what everyone was thinking. "That horse of his," she said, her voice gentle but concerned. "What will become of her? She's been Arthur's shadow for so long. I can't imagine her with anyone else." The question hung in the air like an accusation, and Liam felt the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders like a physical burden. He had a life in London, a career that demanded his attention, a small flat that could barely accommodate a houseplant, let alone a horse. The practical impossibilities were overwhelming, yet the thought of separating Willow from the only home she had ever known felt like a second betrayal of Arthur's memory. As the afternoon wore on and the crowd began to thin, Liam found himself walking alone through the village streets, past the honey-colored stone cottages that Arthur had loved, past the ancient walls that had stood for centuries, and would stand for centuries more. The weight of grief and responsibility pressed down on him with each step, and he realized that he was walking not toward any particular destination, but away from the impossible decisions that awaited him. It was nearly sunset when he finally turned toward the cottage, his steps heavy with reluctance and dread. The familiar sight of the stone building, with its climbing roses and carefully tended garden, brought a fresh wave of sorrow. This had been Arthur's sanctuary, the place where he had healed from Margaret's death and found new purpose in caring for Willow. Now it felt like a museum of memories, beautiful but somehow lifeless without its animating spirit. But as Liam approached the gate, he saw something that stopped him in his tracks. Willow stood at the fence closest to the cottage, but she was not alone. A small group of villagers had gathered. David Morrison with a bucket of fresh water, Mrs. Henderson with a bag of apples, young Tommy Fletcher from the bakery with what looked like sugar cubes. They moved around the mare with quiet reverence, offering comfort in the only way they knew how. "She hasn't eaten since yesterday morning," David said when he noticed Liam's approach. "Won't touch her hay, won't drink unless we bring the water right to her. It's like she's waiting for something." Liam looked at Willow, really looked at her, and saw something that broke his heart anew. The magnificent mare who had been Arthur's pride and joy appeared diminished, her head hanging low, her usual alertness replaced by a profound sadness that seemed to emanate from her very soul. She acknowledged Liam's presence with a brief glance, but her attention remained fixed on the cottage, on the window of Arthur's bedroom, where she had maintained her vigil during his final illness. "She's grieving," Mrs. Henderson said softly, "just like the rest of us." As the villagers gradually dispersed, leaving Liam alone with Willow in the gathering dusk, he found himself face to face with the magnitude of what Arthur had entrusted to him. This wasn't just about finding a new home for a horse. This was about honoring a bond that had transcended the ordinary boundaries between human and animal, about preserving something precious and irreplaceable in a world that seemed increasingly indifferent to such connections. The wind picked up, rustling through the leaves of the oak tree where Arthur had first found Willow all those years ago, and Liam could have sworn he heard his uncle's voice carried on the breeze. "She saved me, Liam. Now it's your turn to save her." Standing there in the twilight, with Willow's dark eyes reflecting the last light of day, Liam realized that the most important decision of his life was no decision at all. Some bonds were too sacred to break, some promises too profound to abandon. Arthur's legacy wasn't just the cottage or the memories. It was the living embodiment of love and loyalty that stood before him, waiting with infinite patience for someone to choose hope over convenience, connection over comfort. The future remained uncertain, filled with challenges he couldn't yet imagine. But one thing had become crystal clear. Willow's story was far from over, and somehow, impossibly, it had become his story too. The morning of Arthur's funeral dawned with a peculiar stillness that seemed to hold the very air in suspension. Liam stood at the kitchen window of the cottage, watching the mist roll across the Cotswolds countryside like a gray shroud, and felt the weight of finality settling over everything he had known and loved about this place. The funeral service had been scheduled for 10 o'clock at St. Michael's, the same ancient stone church where Arthur and Margaret had exchanged vows nearly 5 decades earlier. But it was barely 7, and already Liam could feel the day pressing against him with an urgency that had nothing to do with time. Arthur lay in the front parlor, peaceful in the simple oak coffin that he had, with characteristic foresight, selected and paid for months earlier. The undertaker had done his work with dignity and care, and Arthur looked as if he were merely sleeping, his weathered hands folded across his chest, his face bearing the same gentle expression that had become so familiar during his final weeks. But it was the absence of sound that struck Liam most forcefully. The cottage, which had been filled with the soft rhythm of Arthur's breathing for so many months, now felt hollow and strange, as if the very walls were holding their breath. Outside, Willow maintained her vigil with a steadfastness that bordered on the supernatural. She had not moved from her position by the fence since the moment Arthur had drawn his last breath 3 days earlier, and her behavior had become increasingly concerning. She refused all food, turning her head away from the hay and oats that Liam brought to her with desperate regularity. Water she would accept, but only when it was brought directly to her, and even then she drank with a mechanical efficiency that suggested survival instinct rather than any real desire to continue living. Dr. Harrison had visited twice, ostensibly to examine Willow, but really, Liam suspected, to witness for himself the extraordinary display of grief that had captivated the entire village. The veterinarian had run his hands along Willow's flanks, checked her eyes and breathing, and pronounced her physically sound but emotionally devastated in a way that defied medical explanation. "I've seen animals mourn before," Dr. Harrison had told Liam quietly, as they stood watching Willow's motionless form. Dogs that refuse to eat after their owners die. Cats that search for missing companions. But this is different. She's not just grieving. She's keeping vigil, as if she believes her presence alone might somehow call him back. The villagers had begun to gather even before the official funeral procession was scheduled to begin. They came in small groups, speaking in hushed tones, their eyes drawn inevitably to the remarkable sight of Willow standing sentinel in the morning mist. Mrs. Henderson, from the post office, had brought a wreath of wildflowers, which she placed carefully on the fence post nearest to where Willow stood. David Morrison arrived with his wife, both of them carrying small tokens of remembrance: a bottle of Arthur's favorite whiskey, a book of poetry that he had often quoted during their evening conversations. But it was the arrival of the hearse that seemed to break something fundamental in Willow's composure. The black vehicle moved slowly up the lane, its presence unmistakable and final, and as it came to a stop before the cottage, Willow lifted her head and released a sound that made every person present feel their hearts contract with sympathetic pain. It was not quite a whinny, not quite a cry, but something deeper and more primal, a vocalization of loss so pure and devastating that several of the gathered mourners began to weep openly. The undertakers moved with practiced efficiency, their movements respectful and measured as they prepared to transfer Arthur's coffin from the cottage to the hearse. Liam walked beside them, his hand resting briefly on the polished wood as they navigated the narrow doorway, and he found himself speaking to his uncle as if Arthur could still hear him. "The whole village has come to see you off," Liam whispered. "And Willow, she's been waiting for you, just like she always did." As the coffin was loaded into the hearse, Willow's agitation became more pronounced. She began to pace along the fence line, her movements sharp and urgent, her calls becoming more frequent and desperate. The sound carried across the countryside, echoing off the stone walls and ancient trees, and Liam realized that every creature within miles must be hearing this lament, this raw expression of a love that transcended the boundaries between species. The procession to the church was unlike anything the village had ever witnessed. The hearse moved slowly through the narrow lanes, followed by a line of cars carrying family and friends. But it was the sight behind them that drew gasps of amazement and tears of recognition. Willow had somehow managed to break free from her paddock, though later investigation would reveal that the gate had been left mysteriously unlatched and was following the funeral procession at a distance, her powerful legs carrying her along the roadside with a determination that was both heartbreaking and magnificent. Liam, riding in the car directly behind the hearse, turned to see Willow maintaining her position about 50 yards back, her head held high, her gait steady and purposeful. She made no attempt to approach the vehicles, seemed to understand instinctively that she must keep her distance, but her presence was unmistakable and profoundly moving. Other drivers had pulled to the side of the road, their occupants emerging to witness this extraordinary display of loyalty and love. "She's following him," whispered Mrs. Patterson, the nurse who had cared for Arthur during his final weeks. "She's not going to let him go alone." At the church, the situation became more complex. Willow had positioned herself at the edge of the churchyard, just beyond the ancient stone wall that marked the consecrated ground, and there she stood as the human mourners filed into the sanctuary. The vicar, Reverend Matthews, emerged briefly to observe this unusual addition to his congregation, and after a moment of consideration, he nodded to himself, as if reaching some internal decision. "She may stay," he announced to the gathered crowd. "If ever there was a soul that deserved to be present at such a moment, it is hers." The service itself was a celebration of Arthur's life, filled with readings from his favorite poets, hymns that he had hummed while working in his garden, and eulogies that painted a picture of a man who had found his greatest joy in the simple act of caring for another living being. But throughout the ceremony, everyone present was aware of the silent figure beyond the wall, the magnificent horse who had become as much a part of Arthur's story as any human friend or family member. When the service concluded and the mourners began to file out for the burial, they found that Willow had moved closer to the wall, her head extended over the ancient stones, as if she were trying to hear the words being spoken within. Her eyes, those impossibly expressive dark eyes that had captivated Arthur from their first meeting, were fixed on the church doors with an intensity that suggested she understood exactly what was taking place. The burial was conducted in the small cemetery behind the church, where Arthur would rest beside Margaret beneath a simple headstone that bore both their names and the dates that marked their earthly journey. As the coffin was lowered into the ground, Willow's calls resumed, but now they had changed in character. No longer desperate or urgent, they had become something closer to a song, a mournful, beautiful melody that seemed to carry Arthur's spirit up into the gray sky above. Liam stood at the graveside, his hand full of earth that he was meant to cast onto the coffin, and found himself looking not at the grave but at Willow. In that moment, he understood something that would change the course of his life forever. This was not just about saying goodbye to his uncle. This was about honoring a bond that had transcended every conventional understanding of love and loyalty. Arthur and Willow had saved each other, had created something beautiful and pure in a world that often seemed devoid of such connections. As the last prayers were spoken and the mourners began to disperse, Willow remained at her post beyond the wall, her vigil continuing even as the formal ceremonies concluded. She would stay there until well after sunset, the villagers later reported, her silhouette visible against the darkening sky like a monument to devotion itself. And in that moment, as Liam watched her solitary figure maintaining its watch over the place where Arthur now rested, he knew that his uncle's story was far from over. It lived on in the magnificent creature who had chosen to love without reservation, to trust without condition, and to grieve without shame. The promise that Arthur had made to Willow on that rainy morning so many years ago, the promise to never give up, to always choose hope over despair, had become a legacy that would endure long after the last mourner had gone home. The circle was not closing after all. It was simply beginning a new revolution, with Willow at its center carrying forward the love that had transformed them all. The sound that shattered the morning stillness was unlike anything the Cotswolds had ever heard. A crash of splintering wood and breaking glass that sent birds exploding from the ancient oak trees in clouds of panicked wings. Liam, who had been standing in the cottage kitchen speaking quietly with Mrs. Patterson about the final arrangements, felt his heart stop as the unmistakable sound of destruction erupted from the direction of Willow's stable. Through the window, he could see the mare's powerful form charging across the paddock, her hooves thundering against the earth with desperate purpose. The stable door hung in twisted fragments, and the wooden fence that had contained her for 5 years lay in splintered ruins. But it was her destination that filled Liam with a terror so profound it seemed to freeze his blood in his veins. Willow was heading directly for the cottage, her eyes wild with a grief-fueled madness that transformed her from beloved companion into something primal and unstoppable. "Get back!" Liam shouted to Mrs. Patterson, pushing the elderly nurse behind the kitchen counter as Willow's massive form appeared at the French doors, that led from the garden into the front parlor. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, horse and human stared at each other through the glass, and Liam could see in Willow's dark eyes a pain so raw and desperate that it took his breath away. This was not the gentle, intelligent creature who had been Arthur's shadow for so many years. This was a being consumed by loss, driven by instincts older than civilization itself. The impact, when it came, was devastating. Willow's front hooves struck the glass doors with the force of a battering ram, sending shards exploding inward in a glittering cascade of destruction. The mare pushed through the opening, her powerful body filling the doorway as she entered the cottage where she had never been allowed to set foot during Arthur's lifetime. Her breathing was labored, her coat dark with sweat, and her eyes held a wildness that spoke of boundaries crossed and rules abandoned in the face of unbearable grief. Mrs. Patterson screamed, pressing herself against the kitchen wall as Willow moved through the cottage with surprising grace despite her size. The mare seemed to know exactly where she was going, her hooves clicking against the hardwood floors as she navigated the narrow hallway that led to the front parlor where Arthur lay in his simple oak coffin. Liam followed at a distance, his mind reeling with the impossibility of what he was witnessing. Willow had never been inside the cottage, had never seen the layout of the rooms, yet she moved with the certainty of someone who had walked these halls 1,000 times. She paused at the entrance to the parlor, her great head lowering as she took in the scene before her. The flowers, the candles, the peaceful figure of Arthur surrounded by the trappings of human mourning. What happened next would be burned into Liam's memory for the rest of his life. Willow approached the coffin with a reverence that seemed almost human, her movements slow and deliberate. She lowered her massive head until her muzzle was inches from Arthur's still face, and then she began to make a sound that was unlike anything Liam had ever heard from her before. It was not a whinny or a neigh, but something deeper, more complex, a vocalization that seemed to carry the weight of years of love, of shared mornings and quiet evenings, of a bond that had sustained them both through the darkest periods of their lives. The sound filled the cottage, echoing off the stone walls and wooden beams, and Liam found himself weeping as he listened to what could only be described as a lament, a song of grief so pure and profound that it seemed to give voice to every loss, every goodbye, every moment of love that had ever existed between two souls who had found salvation in each other. But then, as Willow's song reached its crescendo, something extraordinary happened. Arthur's chest, which had been still for hours, rose with the faintest suggestion of breath. It was so subtle that Liam almost missed it, so slight that it might have been a trick of the light or the desperate imagination of a grieving nephew. But Mrs. Patterson, whose trained eye had witnessed the final moments of countless lives, gasped and rushed forward. "There!" she cried, her voice sharp with professional urgency. "Did you see that?" His chest moved. Liam stared at his uncle's face, searching for any sign of life, any indication that the impossible was happening. And then he saw it. The barely perceptible flutter of Arthur's eyelids, the slight parting of his lips as air moved through lungs that had been still for hours. "Call an ambulance!" Mrs. Patterson shouted, her hands already moving to check Arthur's pulse, her years of medical training taking over despite the surreal nature of the situation. "Now, Liam, call them now!" As Liam fumbled for his phone, his hands shaking so violently he could barely dial the numbers, Willow continued her vigil beside the coffin. But her demeanor had changed completely. The wildness was gone. replaced by an alertness that seemed to radiate hope. She stood perfectly still, her eyes fixed on Arthur's face, as if she were willing him back to consciousness through sheer force of love. The paramedics, when they arrived, were initially skeptical. Death certificates had been signed, funeral arrangements had been made, and the idea that someone could return from such a state seemed to defy every medical principle they knew. But as they examined Arthur, their expressions changed from professional doubt to amazement. There was a pulse, weak but unmistakable. There was breathing, shallow but steady, and when they lifted his eyelids, his pupils responded to light. "It's impossible," one of the paramedics muttered as they prepared Arthur for transport to the hospital. "I've never seen anything like this." The man was clinically dead. Dr. Harrison, who arrived at the hospital shortly after the ambulance, had a different explanation. "Catalepsy," he said, his voice filled with wonder as he reviewed Arthur's test results. "It's extremely rare, but it can mimic death so completely that even medical professionals can be fooled." The stress of his heart condition, combined with the emotional trauma of separation from Willow, must have triggered an episode so profound that all vital signs became undetectable. But Liam, standing beside Arthur's hospital bed as his uncle slowly returned to consciousness, knew that the medical explanation, while technically accurate, missed the deeper truth. Willow had not just witnessed Arthur's return to life, she had somehow called him back from the threshold of death itself. Her desperate journey into the cottage, her lament beside his coffin, her refusal to accept the finality of loss, all of it had been part of something that transcended medical understanding. When Arthur's eyes finally opened, the first word he whispered was "Willow." And when they brought him home 3 days later, weak but alive, the first thing he did was walk slowly to the paddock where Willow waited. The reunion was gentle, profound, and wordless. Two souls who had found each other again after touching the very edge of forever. The cottage bore the scars of Willow's desperate entry for months afterward. The replaced French doors, the repaired floors, the lingering reminder of the day when love had literally broken down the barriers between life and death. But no one in the village spoke of it as destruction. They called it a miracle, a testament to the power of bonds that run deeper than the physical world can contain. And in the years that followed, when visitors came to hear the story of Arthur and Willow, they would always ask about that morning when everything changed. Arthur would smile and stroke Willow's neck, and he would say simply, "She wouldn't let me go, and I couldn't bear to leave her behind." It was, perhaps, the most perfect definition of love that anyone had ever heard. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Cotswolds countryside as Arthur Pendleton stepped carefully down the stone path from his cottage, his movements deliberate, but no longer labored. 6 months had passed since that extraordinary day when Willow's desperate love had called him back from the very threshold of death, and the transformation in both man and horse was nothing short of miraculous. The cataleptic episode, as Dr. Harrison continued to call it with scientific precision, had left Arthur weakened but somehow renewed, as if his brief journey to the edge of existence had shown him truths that could only be learned in the space between heartbeats. Willow waited for him at the garden gate, her magnificent form silhouetted against the morning mist that still clung to the ancient dry stone walls. She had grown even more beautiful in the months following Arthur's recovery, her coat gleaming with health, her eyes bright with an intelligence that seemed to encompass not just the present moment, but all the moments they had shared, and all those yet to come. When she saw Arthur approaching, She nickered softly, a sound of pure contentment that had become the soundtrack of their renewed life together. "Good morning, my girl," Arthur whispered, his voice still carrying the slight rasp that had remained since his illness, but warm with affection. He reached out to stroke her neck, feeling the strong pulse beneath the silky coat, the steady rhythm of life that matched his own healing heart. "Ready for our walk?" Their daily journey had become something of a pilgrimage for the villagers of the Cotswolds. Word of Arthur's miraculous recovery and Willow's role in calling him back from death had spread far beyond the boundaries of their small community, drawing visitors from across England who came to witness what many were calling a modern miracle. But Arthur and Willow paid little attention to the curious onlookers who sometimes gathered along their route. Their walks were sacred time, moments of communion that transcended the ordinary boundaries between human and animal, between the possible and the impossible. Today's destination was special, the oak tree where Arthur had first found Willow all those years ago, now marked with a small bronze plaque that the village council had installed to commemorate what they called the place where love conquered death. The inscription, suggested by Liam and approved unanimously by the council, read simply, "Here 2 souls found each other in the darkness and chose to walk toward the light together." As they made their way along the familiar path, Arthur found himself reflecting on the changes that had transformed not just his life, but the entire community. Liam had made the decision to leave his London firm permanently, establishing a small architectural practice in the village that specialized in the restoration of historic buildings. The young man had discovered, much to his own surprise, that he possessed his uncle's gift for seeing potential in damaged structures, for understanding how broken things could be made beautiful again. "You know, Willow," Arthur said as they paused beside a stream that babbled its eternal song through the countryside, "I used to think that saving you was the most important thing I'd ever done. But I understand now that it wasn't really about saving at all. It was about choosing to believe in something bigger than our own pain." Willow turned her head to look at him, those impossibly expressive eyes holding depths of understanding that continued to amaze everyone who met her. Dr. Harrison, who had become a regular visitor to the cottage, often spoke of the mare's unusual intelligence, her ability to sense changes in Arthur's condition before any medical instrument could detect them. But Arthur knew it went deeper than that. Willow didn't just sense his physical state. She was connected to his very soul, bound to him by ties that transcended the material world. The oak tree stood as magnificent as ever, its ancient branches reaching toward the sky like arms raised in celebration. Wildflowers had grown in abundance around its base, creating a natural shrine that seemed to honor the miracle that had taken place there. Arthur settled onto the wooden bench that the village had placed beneath the tree, and Willow positioned herself beside him, her head lowering so that he could rest his hand on her muzzle. "Do you remember, girl?" Arthur asked softly. "Do you remember how small you were? How close we came to losing each other before we'd even really found each other?" As if in response, Willow moved closer, her warm breath stirring the silver hair at Arthur's temple. In that moment, surrounded by the beauty of the Cotswolds morning and the presence of the creature who had become his salvation, Arthur felt a peace so profound it seemed to encompass not just his own life, but all of existence. The sound of approaching footsteps drew their attention to the path, where Liam appeared with a visitor in tow, a young woman with a camera and notebook who had the eager expression of a journalist. Arthur sighed inwardly, recognizing the look of someone who had come seeking a story about the miracle horse and her devoted owner. "Uncle Arthur," Liam called out as they approached. This is Sarah Mitchell from the BBC. She's working on a documentary about the bond between humans and animals, and she'd like to speak with you about Willow. Arthur studied the young woman, noting the genuine curiosity in her eyes rather than the sensationalistic hunger he had learned to recognize in other reporters who had sought them out. "What would you like to know, Miss Mitchell?" "I've heard the stories, of course," Sarah said, settling onto the grass near the bench with respectful distance. "About how you saved Willow as a foal and how she saved you in return. But I'm more interested in what you've learned from each other, what this relationship has taught you about love, about loyalty, about the connections that bind us all together." Arthur was quiet for a long moment, his hand moving gently along Willow's neck as he considered the question. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of years of experience, of loss and recovery, of love that had transcended every expectation. "I think," Arthur said slowly, "that Willow taught me that love isn't something you fall into or out of. It's something you choose every day, even when it's difficult, even when it hurts. When I found her by this tree, I could have walked away. It would have been the practical thing to do, the sensible thing. But I chose to try, to hope, to believe that something broken could be made whole again." He paused, looking down at Willow, who had closed her eyes in contentment at his touch. "And when I was dying, when I had given up on everything including myself, she chose not to let me go. She chose to fight for us, to break down every barrier between life and death to call me back. That's what real love does. It refuses to accept defeat, refuses to believe that any ending is truly final." Sarah scribbled notes furiously, clearly moved by Arthur's words. "And what would you say to people who might dismiss this as coincidence, who don't believe in the kind of connection you describe?" Arthur smiled, the expression transforming his weathered face with warmth and wisdom. "I'd say that they're entitled to their skepticism. But I'd also say that some truths can't be measured or quantified or explained by science alone. Some truths can only be experienced, lived, felt in the deepest parts of our hearts. Willow and I know what we've shared, what we've given each other. That knowledge doesn't require anyone else's validation." As if to emphasize his point, Willow opened her eyes and turned to look directly at Sarah, her gaze so intelligent and knowing that the journalist gasped audibly. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, woman and horse regarded each other, and Sarah felt something shift inside her chest. A recognition, perhaps, of the profound mystery that surrounded all living things, the invisible threads that connected every heart to every other heart. "I understand," Sarah whispered, her professional composure giving way to genuine awe. "I think I'm beginning to understand." The interview continued for another hour, but the real communication had already taken place in that moment of recognition. That instant when Sarah had looked into Willow's eyes and seen not just an animal, but a soul, ancient, wise, and infinitely loving. When she finally packed up her equipment and prepared to leave, she turned back to Arthur with tears in her eyes. "Thank you," she said simply, "for showing me that miracles aren't just stories we tell ourselves. They're real, and they're happening all around us, if we just have the courage to see them." As Sarah and Liam walked back toward the village, Arthur remained beneath the oak tree with Willow, watching the sun climb higher in the sky, and feeling the warmth of another day spreading across the countryside they both loved. In the distance, he could see other visitors approaching, families with children who had heard the story and wanted to meet the famous horse, elderly couples who remembered their own beloved animals, young people seeking hope in a world that often seemed devoid of wonder. "What do you think, girl?" Arthur asked, stroking Willow's mane. "Ready to inspire a few more hearts today?" Willow lifted her head and looked toward the approaching visitors, her ears pricked forward with interest and welcome. In her eyes, Arthur saw the same openness, the same willingness to share their story that had characterized their entire journey together. They had been given something precious, a love that had conquered death itself, and they understood that such gifts were meant to be shared, to kindle hope in other hearts, to remind the world that some bonds are truly unbreakable. Standing slowly, Arthur prepared to greet their visitors, knowing that each person who met Willow would carry away a piece of their story, a reminder that love, in its purest form, is the most powerful force in the universe. And beside him, Willow stood ready to offer her own silent testimony to the truth that had sustained them both. That every ending is also a beginning. Every goodbye contains the seed of a new hello. And every heart that chooses love over fear becomes part of an eternal story that will never truly end. The legend of Willow's promise had become more than just their story. It had become a beacon of hope for anyone who had ever loved, ever lost, ever dared to believe that some connections transcend even death itself. And in the golden light of the Cotswolds morning, surrounded by the beauty of the countryside and the presence of souls drawn to witness their miracle, Arthur and Willow continued to write new chapters in a story that would inspire hearts for generations to come.